my God.
Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Let's do it.
Very excited to see such a packed room for our topic today, AI and Regulatory Innovation in Healthcare Shaping the Future. My name is Paul Howard. I'm Senior Director of Public Policy at Amicus Therapeutics. I'm also a former FDAer. I was one of Scott Gottlieb's senior advisors at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration from 2017 to 2019. And when we were at the agency, we like to say that the FDA was the air traffic controller for innovation in the US, helping to bring all of those innovations to land safely and effectively to serve the public health. And at the same time, if you're the air traffic controller, you've got to make sure that the software that you're using to bring in the planes syncs effortlessly with the software that's running the planes. And I think that's the topic of conversation today, because the fit between the tools that we're developing in artificial intelligence and machine learning, from bench to bedside, to improve public health outcomes, improve our ability to deliver safer and more effective therapeutics and medical devices to patients, really depends upon getting that regulatory framework right. So for our conversation today, we're going to focus on what we like to call a SWOT analysis. And it's not policemen running into a room with guns. It is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And that is going to be the lens through which we're going to analyze both the technologies that our terrific panel today is going to be talking about, each from their own perspective, to pick a case study or example to help us understand how the tool, that AI ML tool, can be used, what its advantages, what its weaknesses are, and then at the same time analyze the regulatory framework that's evolving, both in terms of new authorities that regulators and agencies in the US, UK, Europe, and around the world are developing, existing guidance that we think can be applied to those tools without too much change, and then a gap analysis. Where are there places where we're still a little bit confused or uncertain about how those tools are going to be applied, and the questions that we think regulators and stakeholders still need to answer to bring those products, to bring those planes and tools that we know are going to be so powerful into a safe landing to maintain public confidence. And we've got a terrific panel here. To my right is Chris Hart. He is a partner at Foley Hoag. I knew I'd get that wrong. Mida Pajeskian, who is a founder and principal at Strema, and she is a consultant in the life sciences industry as well as an innovator and entrepreneur. We have Alex Z, who is the chairman and founder of In Silico Medicine, a generative AI-based drug development company. And last but far from least, Brandon Rice, who is the chief product officer at Weave Bio, which is a company using generative AI to build platforms for regulatory submissions, starting with a product that they call Auto IND, which he can talk about a bit more. So I'd like to start, Chris, with you. Through that SWOT analysis lens, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, both of the product or tool that we're looking at, and then the regulatory framework. I know you work a lot in data privacy and data practice management, so maybe that's a place to start. Where do you see the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities?
I think when we're talking about regulation of AI in the healthcare space, a lot of what I would say about that is similar to what I would say in a lot of respects about the privacy space generally, which is, if we're to compare jurisdictions, the EU's approach tends to be very comprehensive. The US's approach tends to be very fragmented and sectoral, and the UK's approach is evolving, and post-Brexit, as you can imagine. So I think, and I think we can think about strengths, weaknesses, and the SWOT analysis in that respect. So if we're to think about the US market, the US jurisdictions, when I say it's sectoral in the sense that different agencies regulate different things. So HIPAA falls under the rubric of HHS. Devices under also HHS, but FDA in particular. When we're talking about privacy or consumer health data that falls outside of HIPAA's rubric, we're talking about the Federal Trade Commission, or maybe we're even talking about states. So you can see a very fragmented approach where there are lots of different ways of dealing with privacy issues that arise out of AI, safety issues that arise out of AI, discrimination issues that arise out of AI, and that's what I would say are really the three categories of things that regulators are trying to account for and govern. And so In the US, there are different developments in different areas around each one of those different kinds of spaces. And I'm speaking very generally, but just to give you a sense how different it is from, say, the EU. With the EU, privacy, of course, is dealt with the GDPR at a regulatory level with all member states, and it is the same law, with a few exceptions, across all member states. And of course, the UK, even post-Brexit, still has GDPR. The EU has developed the EU AI Act, which the scope is broad enough to encompass any kind of AI system developed that's brought into market by a host of different kinds of definitions, whether it's a developer or it's a distributor or whatever we're going to call it, based on risk. So it's a risk-based law, where a lot of the technologies that we're probably going to be talking about might very well fall under high risk, where there's a lot of regulation around governance, around impact assessments, around the protection of data, around making sure that there's non-discrimination. But then there are also other laws that interact with them and that are deliberately interacting with these larger laws. Like, for example, the EU Cyber Resilience Act, which was just passed by the EU Council. We're waiting for Parliament to have its final say. And that will also govern security around the kinds of devices and software that we're talking about. And when I say in the UK it's still developing, post-Brexit, the UK does have, of course, has its version of the GDPR, and it has its version of the Medical Device and Safety Administration, but it's still in the process of trying to figure out, and we're talking about strengths and weaknesses, to what extent do we want to protect safety and privacy and against discrimination, but also allow for innovation. And that's really, I think, where the tension is.
And in the US, we also have to deal with the fact, I think Colorado and California are looking at developing their own AI-based regulations, and California has its own Consumer Protection Act. So in the US, we've got a real patchwork of regulations that innovators have to deal with. Mita, does that resonate with you? And from an entrepreneur's perspective, looking at this, how do you see companies, especially small and medium-sized companies, trying to navigate these trade-offs?
Absolutely. I think Chris did a wonderful job setting up sort of the foundation of what I was going to build upon, and that's the differences between the EU AI Act and the FDA, and adding a little bit more to it in context of electronic health record system, which is one of the areas that I follow. It's actually outside the jurisdiction of an FDA, and it falls on the Office of National Coordinator, ONC. And I believe at the end of last year, they put out some guidance on how to consider, AI tools that are developed and integrated within electronic health record system, but that's still a very broad area. And, you can think of EHRs, having predictive analytics for patient, decision support, but then also there's operational efficiency like billing compliance. So it's a very broad place where I don't think we quite know all the details yet. And I think a lot of companies are eager to integrate AI into their EHR, or buy it essentially buy another service and patchwork it together with their electronic health record system. Another thing to look at it from an EU perspective, I think the EU has done a more comprehensive job of putting out the guidance. I have some thoughts on that, but I think we would leave it for another question. But in terms of electronic health record system, they fall under high risk applications. So there's a lot to consider about privacy, about safety, and equality. So there's a lot going on, and I think most of it is guidance that is a good place to start. But I think to your point, with small companies or large companies, there's a lot to consider when you're a small company wanting to leverage AI, whether it's to build it or to buy it and use it. And also larger companies, especially when they're global, they have to navigate this landscape where in the US they might have to work through certain principles, and then when they go to EU or UK, they're going to have to follow some other principles. So it's very complex. I think that's how I'll end it for now.
Mita, could you just follow up a little bit? You had a really interesting blog post not long ago. I think it was implementation where AI goes to die. How does that play out? Because I think you touched on it right there, that the fragmentation, especially across health systems and EHR systems, make it very difficult to scale up the data you need to have really reliable, especially across populations, and then data monitoring over time. Do you see that as one of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now?
Absolutely, and I would think of it in two sort of steps, or phases, if you will. One is the fact that our healthcare system is fragmented, our healthcare information systems are very much fragmented. Think about the fact that when you go to your physician, if you need to move states, getting that medical records, getting to the next doctor is certainly possible, but very difficult for average person to do. And so that's a challenge, right? There's a lot of different fragmented systems, but then within that, there's a lot of very differently structured data. So some EHR systems have managed to, incorporate a lot of natural language processing. That's still very early on, to make the unstructured data, all the paperwork and things that we, long form text that your physician wrote as a medical record for you, getting those into more structured data. But again, the structure of the data, the format of the data, the quality of the data, these are all, challenges that I think, organizations would need to navigate. So think of it sort of, we need to have better data, we need to structure and format it better, but we also need to get our information systems to talk to each other so that we could collaborate.
That's really helpful. And Alex, for our industry, for the biotech industry, 90% of what we do fails at often astonishingly high cost. Your company in Silico Medicine is really working to bring a transformation to that system. From where you're sitting today, how do you see the overlap between what we need from the regulatory systems and where we're at with the science?
Sure. So first of all, need to apologize. I'm filling in this panel, so whatever I say, I hope I don't regret later on. So it's unfiltered and uncensored, unprepared. And I'll try to speak from the practical perspective. So within Insilico, we've managed to, over the past few years, to take 7 drugs into human clinical trials, most of them from scratch, from novel target, novel molecule, using generative AI. To me, I did not expect that, and I actually did not expect to be facing the regulatory environment the way we are today, honestly. So it's a lucky coincidence as well. And from the strength perspective, if we're looking from the SWOT perspective, I can tell you that the US regulatory system is extremely efficient. I would be the last person to say that, because AI companies usually are saying, okay, well, the regulation is where things go to die. But once you actually start filing the applications, if your data package is good, the FDA it's a very efficient system. It has very specific time to respond. So 30 days, 45 days, 60 days. There are deadlines, there are timelines, and those systems, those processes that have been established for decades, they work. And they work not only to protect the consumer, but also to accelerate drug discovery. And you also realize that those systems are there for a reason. So I can tell you from the drug discovery point, you can actually go from 0 to 100. So my average time from 0 to preclinical candidate is now about 12 to 13 months. So time to IND submission is about 2 years, which is pretty substantial considering the targets that we're working with are usually more novel than what you got used to, right? So usually pharma companies are saying, see you in phase 2, complete, right? When you're partnering. They don't like novelty. But I can tell you 2 stories. So one is for discovery side. You can go very quickly, and also you don't really need a lot of proprietary data. So the US government did something great to this world. So in the 90s, they made all the publicly available data accessible to the world. So now I calculate that approximately $2 trillion worth of funding is available at your fingertips for generative AI. So you have to be really bad at generative not to be able to use that for target discovery, where you have, one chance, right? And you need to bet 60, 70 million bucks to get through, phase 2. So you don't have a lot of bets to make. So you will have to balance novelty and confidence. That's why a lot of publicly available data is enough to discover novel targets and disease hypotheses. Once you are going clinical, there are all the barriers that you need in place to protect the consumer, to protect the patient, and to enable fast drug discovery. So it's a very well-oiled system. And I actually just want to, say all the great things about the current regulatory system. In terms of the weaknesses, I think that generative systems nowadays, they still hallucinate and there are problems. So we need to get over those problems, and the only way to go around that is benchmarking. So if you don't benchmark all the time, you won't be able to get to the level of quality you need to service the patient and deliver, even like we do it at an atomic level now with pretty high accuracy. In terms of threats, I think overregulation and also the fear of AI, that's the biggest threat. Because so far, ChatGPT is a new phenomenon, but we are almost 2 years into the game already. Who has been hurt? Human genomic sequencing is 20 years out. Who has been hurt? Okay, you find that your mama or papa is not your papa, but the insurance companies are, now there is a lot of theft of this data. We've seen that with 23andMe. I'm sorry for saying that. Because I'm in that database, right? My genome is there. And I haven't seen a lot of people being hurt, right? So we probably should be more mindful about the opportunities that AI brings rather than the threats. And most of the time, those kind of threats are imposed by people who want to scare you to protect you. And usually it's probably not a good idea to follow those kind of threats. It's very important to be educated on AI.
That's terrific. Now to hand the ball over to Brandon. Brandon, as you know, as anyone who works in the industry knows, the amount of data that's exchanged between sponsors and regulators, particularly the FDA, is just mind-boggling. The time to prepare the submission and then the questions that go back and forth between regulators and sponsors about the submissions to try and iron out any potential problems, questions, data quality issues in the data are very time-consuming. And in this industry where a couple of months is a couple of $100 million, what are the tools that you're seeing that you're developing that can help both regulators and sponsors get on the same page and drive those kinds of efficiencies that just haven't been possible before?
Yeah, so so we're building a product at Weave, which is called AutoAndy, as you mentioned, Paul, and we're using large language models. That is kind of the core technology there to speed up and streamline as much of the regulatory process as we can. So that's where we kind of saw the opportunity here, especially when large language models kind of hit the scene, was there's a lot of information that comes out of drug development discovery that needs to be distilled and formulated, and that's essentially what a regulatory submission is. And that process takes a ton of time, it has a lot of risk associated with it, and it uses up the same brains that would otherwise be used in most cases to find more drugs, make more drugs. It's the scientists who have done the work who are writing a lot of the material in the application. And so that seemed like a shame to us, and so that's the what we're trying to address. And not just the writing part of it, but every aspect of preparing an IND is presented opportunities that we've found. So we started with LLMs, which, kind of, I think in terms of the SWOT framing, the strength is they're extremely flexible, and you don't need a ton of data to get them to start to work for you. And that's very nice and important for us because INDs are not publicly disclosed. There aren't many examples out there. So we didn't have a lot to work with as we were getting started. We were able to get a few partners who trusted us and shared theirs with us. And that's what we had to go on, and now we have more and more as we get more folks coming into the platform. But you can do a lot with a little with LLMs, which is very nice. And they're beautiful at the text to tables, transforming information from one form into another. And I think there's, as an aside, there's opportunities there when it comes to the AAIH data where a lot of the problems are structure, formatting, missing data, imputing things. It's very tedious to work through all that, and you have to have a PhD data scientist to do it, and it becomes a bottleneck. So just transforming data from one form into another is something that large language models are very good at. and we're trying to use that to the greatest benefit possible. They don't think, though, right? And so that's one of the challenges that we face is, I think, hype, that's a threat, and we're kind of coming down off of that now, I think. But they don't think, they make mistakes, they hallucinate, and so there is a lot of coaxing that is required to get them to do what you want. It's not driving an automobile so much anymore, it's riding horses again. You can kind of steer them where you want them to go, but you got to persuade them to get there. And so it's not the most straightforward thing to get them to do exactly what you want them to do. And I agree with Alex's point that characterization is important, and that's something that we've done extensively with our system, especially at the early stages, to understand, especially hallucinations and things like this. And the short of that is that there are choices you can make and things that you can do to coax large language models that are widely available to be very accurate. I think something that people often forget is humans also hallucinate. You just don't call it that. But we've seen a lot of drafts of INDs, and there's plenty of errors. People get tired, hungry, whatever, and they make mistakes. And those mistakes, there's a lot of processes to catch those, but sometimes they make their way through. So it's not a matter of being perfect. It's just a matter of being good enough for us. And one sort of linchpin of our strategy as well, addressing that kind of threat side when we see an opportunity, is we don't want to replace people. We just want to make people faster and better at what they can do and should do. In making drugs, we have a lot of extremely brilliant and educated people who are doing a lot of menial labor, pulling data together, stuffing text into tables. And so we want to free people from that so that they can focus on science, strategy, things like this. So we're not trying to find new drugs with AI, although it's obviously like a very laudable application of the technology. We want to make the whole process of bringing drugs to market faster, cheaper, less error prone.
And Brandon, could you talk about maybe particularly in this concept and this place in the system, you're dealing with highly structured data sets for regulatory submissions. Does that give you an advantage because you have domain expertise, you've got very highly structured applications, and then the sponsors who are coming to you have a backlog of applications they've already submitted that allow you to get training? Is that a leg up in particular for this application? And then down the line, how do you see that also scaling from the regulatory perspective of regulators also are dealing with just incredible amounts of data, much of it very highly structured, but just multi-omic safety data coming from all different sorts of sources. So they're struggling with the same problem at a higher scale, but at least there's a common tool that you can both use to scale up. Is that a fair characterization?
Well put. So, the reason we chose INDs as the place to start is it's right in that Goldilocks zone of structured and unstructured. There's enough structure to grab onto. There's a CTD, there's guidance, there is some amount of uniformity to that, not just in the US, but across the world by AAIH. So that is enough to kind of put guardrails around what we need to do, but it's not paint by numbers. Every drug is different, there are different sets of studies, different modalities, different findings, and
different endpoints.
And so it's not a form-filling exercise at the end. So it does take considerable time, thought, and expertise to actually be able to do it and pull it off. But what we're finding is that it's pretty much perfect in that zone of it's structured enough that it's tractable for these technologies, but not so structured that the problem was already solved many years ago. It's just kind of coming into fruition now. And as it relates to the regulators, I think the universal thing that we see in here, both from our customers and prospects as well as regulators, is that the whole world wants to go towards structured data. And but that's not how people work. We think in narratives, we write, we tell each other stories. And so that's always what you're starting with. But when it comes onto a reviewer's desk, you need something that's a lot more distilled and easy to understand quickly and compare. And so we think this will hasten our path to that future where everything can be structured.
It's not like we can have 100% structured data for everything because the technologies change, the kinds of data that we collect change. so that the ground is shifting, and if we had a perfectly structured data set, it would probably be useless because it would be outdated in 5 years just because of the new ways we organize and analyze data. Can I ask the panel a question? By the way, I'm going to go for a few more minutes here, but then please feel free to raise your hand, walk up to the microphone, introduce yourself, and ask questions. We want to call the Ghostbusters. We know who to call. So if you have a tool that you want to bring to the agency, who do you bring it to? The FDA actually has, obviously, there are different centers at the agency. If you're developing a medical device, you go to CDRH. If you're a biologic, you go to CBER. You've got a drug, you're going to CDER. But there are also programs within FDA. They just opened a new Center of Excellence for Quantitative Medicine. There's an iSTAND program. There are critical path innovation meetings. Could you give some guidance, maybe particularly Alex, start with you, when you're developing one of these tools, and again, for in the pre-regulatory, pre-IND space, there's just a lot of freedom for companies to experiment. If you're using a Ouija board to select your drug candidates, that's probably not going to work well, but I don't know if the FDA actually cares if that's until you make a submission to them. But how do you identify who to talk to get that critical regulatory feedback that can make you successful when you're trying to move one of these tools forward?
So sure. So from the practical perspective, I also thought that I need to find that special point of contact, maybe talk to the director, talk to the high level, to accelerate. Turns out, again, it's a very efficient system, and again, I'm a very unusual kind of person to sing praise to the FDA, but because usually, again,
are there some FDAers in the audience? Former FDAers.
So sorry, I'm not going to kind of say that they are inefficient or you need to do something special. So AI drug discovery allows you to go from zero to clinic very quickly. Basically, it's like getting into a Tesla plate, right? Nowadays, especially if you industrialize that. Once you are in the clinic, you should move with the speed of traffic, at least with your first assets. So you need to ensure that all the check marks are there to demonstrate to everybody that it is working. Otherwise, if you cut the corners, you're going to face a problem, not just for yourself, but also for the industry. And we've seen some of our kind of earlier generation of AI companies that were not generative. They failed, right? Because they tried to go quickly. So what we decided to do, we decided to use a standard approach. So in the preclinical, we are an AI-powered drug discovery company. We're tech bio. In the clinic, we are traditional biotech. And you go to the FDA, show you what they've got, and you show that the quality of your data package is so good that they let you go into the clinic and they approve your IND quickly. So the key idea is to go with an AI-discovered drug all the way into phase 2 complete, right? So that's my dream. After that, I can safely die and say I've left a legacy. But now we're in phase 2. I think we're the only ones out of our cohort who managed to go with an AI-generated therapeutic into phase 2. And there we have to go with the speed of traffic and go through the standard process without asking for special favors. So if the FDA would like to look at our case a little bit closer, we've published a Nature Biotechnology paper that outlines the entire discovery from target discovery, small molecule generation. We did a phase 0 study even in Australia because we wanted to ensure that there is to research the on-target toxicity if there is anything there, right? Because you do microdosing. And then we did 2 parallel phase 1s, one in China, one in the US. Demonstrated that it works, right? And now also we are running 2 parallel phase 2s disconnected. So we were actually smart enough to do that early. One in China, one in the US. Because when you're running for a rare disease, it's actually a good idea to run in China because 1.4 billion people, nothing beats that, right? You can get fully enrolled quickly. And also the regulatory system is also pretty efficient. I was very surprised. And in the US, it's very efficient. So I think you shouldn't ask for special favors. What the FDA needs to do is to look at those case studies and learn how you got there. And then no special favors, yeah. My only problem right now is that biomarker strategy, right? So you usually, and right now you have to fight with your own CMO and your own clinical team. So you actually want to collect more biomarkers to be able to prove that you can go for a massive indication expansion with a drug. And currently, if you want to collect more data, it's not only more expensive, but it also increases the risk, liability, explanation. There are additional regulatory challenges. So with that, it would be a good idea to get into somebody within the FDA. But I think that the FDA is smooth, perfect, don't, screw it up.
And is that because you're working from a generative platform? So you're pulling in information from the entire healthcare ecosystem, and you're not saying, I'm skipping animal testing, I'm skipping in vivo data.
Yeah.
I'm just organizing it and bringing it to you. The target might be novel, the compound might be novel, but you've got a lot of data that you're bringing to the table that reassures regulators.
Exactly. And for everybody in the room, look at our Nature Biotech paper on TNIK, T-N-I-K, really cool target, by the way, multi-purpose. And in that paper, we've released, I think, 18 preclinical experiments. So we nominated 3 preclinical candidates, and all in one data package. In the paper, openly available. We can talk to this paper as well. So it's a pretty cool exercise, yeah.
When we're on this topic here of reliability and convincing the regulators you have really good data, you can't talk about generative AI without talking about hallucination. If you've dealt with ChatGPT, I asked it a question last week, and it gave me a really great summary with a bunch of references, none of which actually existed. So that is still a problem in the system. How do we address that problem? Which Brandon, you said, people hallucinate all the time. It's called novel writing. So there's both a really powerful application that allows us to be creative, and at the same time, you don't want to make mistakes. And FDA has articulated, particularly around, I think, the issue of explainability, and other regulators have said the same thing. Depending on how powerful and accurate your model is, we might not ask for as much explainability because the results speak for themselves, so to speak. But maybe let's talk about that hallucination issue and how we're addressing it. Brandon, why don't you give us some of your thoughts about what you've experienced and where we're going?
Sure. So I completely agree with the sentiment of ask for no special favors. So, for us with INDs, we're just trying to get to the same destination as before. There's nothing different about that. We're just trying to take a faster road to get there. So there's 3 different pieces of it, as far as what we're doing that come to mind. One is there's no way around having to do characterization, and it is laborious. There are ways that you can also use LLMs to speed that up. You can have an LLM look at an LLM's answer and kind of decompose it and tell you how well it works.
And that's one way you try and control for that hallucination issue?
Well, understand at least. And understanding is the first part. I think it's like there's such a rush to go and get involved with AI technology. People forget kind of like the basic scientific principles of it, which is, so you have to be rigorous in that. I don't think there's any way around that. You have to characterize it thoroughly. You have to understand it well. And then you can see where you need to go. And so that's one part of it, is just characterizing thoroughly, being objective, having controls. And a lot of that is having people look at the output, think it through, read it, see if it makes sense. And that's laborious, but it's a one-time cost that then is like amortized over the life of the product or the technology or whatever. The second thing is there are ways to make these technologies more or less accurate. There are choices you can make about which model are you using, how are you parameterizing it, how are you prompting it to do what you want. All of those things have an influence when it comes to LLMs on the output and how true it is to whatever the input information is. So there's a lot of choices to make there that in aggregate can give you very accurate output. So in our small study that we did of our platform, is 99% accurate compared to a first draft from a human, which was something like 89% accurate. The human was not being false in the the missing 10% there. They just weren't citing things. So it's not that it was making mistakes or asleep at the wheel. There's just things that they were taking for granted as common knowledge. And the system that we were using, that we built, was just extra assiduous in dealing with that.
So there's a really iterative relationship between the model and the human supervision that's going into the model, and then the model itself learning from that human supervision.
Yes, and so we're kind of doing a lot of iteration there. And so that's the second thing, is there's a lot of different things that you need to do to make them behave in the way that you want. The final thing is we don't take anything for granted even then. So in our approach to our system, every single sentence of output from the system is directly traceable back to the source document. So that is a separate process within our product, and it's a different algorithm. It has nothing to do with Large language models, it's a lot less exciting and sexy than that, but that's the point, because we want to just be able to, for a human, to be able to quickly and easily verify anything that comes out of that. You don't have to take it for granted. You click on a sentence here, you see the source document right over here.
It's like a car. You've got lots of technology helping you drive. There is still a brake pedal.
That's right.
There's still a steering wheel. Do we have any questions from the audience? Any thoughts, experiences you'd like to share? But while we're waiting for someone to walk up to the microphone, Chris, Mita, does that resonate with you in terms of both the advice you're giving to your clients about how and when to engage with the regulatory authorities and any of these outstanding questions that could generate liability down the road? Chris, I think you talked about the EU AI Act. There is actually quite a bit of liability there that you may not be able to tease completely out of the system.
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked this, because I have a lot of, these are really great examples that you provided, and I have a few reactions to them. I don't want to keep you standing there too long while I react. So the first is that one of the things that I have found interesting in listening to this conversation is a lot of the things that we're seeing, to the extent that there's any consistency in these fragmented areas of law right now, it's transparency, it's being able to communicate to regulators as well as to consumers and patients what the technology is. That's a really important aspect of any law or regulation that we're seeing. There's a lot of convergence there. There's also, I'm not necessarily surprised about your praise to the FDA, but I will be interested a year or two from now to hear your and other reactions when everybody's working on impact assessments. Because that's the other thing that is really interesting. It's not just AI laws, it's also privacy laws, and all of this is impacted by privacy laws, right? We're talking about huge data sets, and regulatory authorities are very, very concerned about sourcing, about breaches, and so there's just a plethora of impact assessments from every single one of these jurisdictions that are going to create a lot of friction, I think, but also provide themselves a lot of data that are going to go back to regulatory authorities in terms of how to deal with these sorts of issues and how to deal with liability, because that's really liability is just a way to make organizations act in the way that policy
take the issue seriously.
Right. And just one last comment on this is that I think that one of the things that's been interesting about the space is that regulation around AI, in name or not, has been going on since well before ChatGPT. What's been really interesting about LLMs and the development of machine learning generally is that regulators, I think, the FDA included, especially with regard to devices, is really thinking hard. They're really thinking hard about, it's one thing to deal with static AI models. It's another one to think about AI technology where the device or the instrument is learning. And that's something the FDA recently has been drafting guidance around that. I think it's a really tough nut to
change
crack.
control.
Yeah, because what the FDA is concerned about, among other things, but what it's concerned about with regard to devices is safety, right? And so if you've got a device in front of you and it appears to be safe for its purposes, but it also has machine learning components where it will evolve, do you have to go through that full re-registration process? I mean, the FDA wants to avoid that. Innovators want to avoid that. But how do you do that in such a way that...
And the community data set involved. It's not like the software is just evolving. The community changes over time. You're developing data to apply in a health system in a particular community. That community is changing. Mita, I want to give you a chance to weigh in there too.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point of the fact that the data is evolving, the communities are evolving, the systems are evolving. So I think in my case, in my experience, I think what was helpful when we were building our own self-developed DHR and experimenting with putting a lot of AI algorithms in there, I think it was assembling the right team of experts that could, foresee some issues and can actually think about, okay, we want to do this, but we need to make sure that we really get our ducks in a row in these different areas. And no one person can be fully equipped to do that. So I think assembling the right team of experts in legal, compliance, software engineering, medicine, go on sort of,
And a
it's
diverse
lot,
team
yeah.
of experts too.
Absolutely, because it takes, I think, a lot of planning and improvising, but also demonstrating to, in our case, to the Office of National Coordinator, ONC, that we were able to explain everything that we were doing, and we're happy to actually show you in person, which is, we worked with an organization that, had a 2-day in-person testing of the system, and you have to produce right there, and, if you didn't, you're not going to pass. So I think that's important.
Trust but verify.
Yes, absolutely.
Please, let's take some questions.
Thanks. Mark Anderson from Pattern. I want to start by thanking all of you because I've been to a lot of these meetings, and you have been more frank and clear, I believe, about LLMs and their hallucinations than I've ever seen. I was at the GTC thing for NVIDIA. I never heard the word hallucination but once out of 4 days and 2 hours of keynote from Jens of my good buddy. So no one talked about it. And I think you're talking about it very eloquently. Having said that, though, I am pretty experienced with this. Some of you may know who I am, but I've been in this business for a long time. I know many of the people involved in creating neural networks and LLMs. I see no evidence at all that this will ever get fixed. I believe it is inherent to the technology. And people who dance around that in the world of medicine. And so I'm getting to a question here, but I've been writing about this for about 2 years. Last week, we saw Microsoft complete 180 reverse. Peter Lee, who runs that operation, Microsoft, went from giving speeches saying this is going to be great for diagnostics to we will never use this for diagnostics. That's a big jump for a $13 billion investment. And so I think my question to you is, I think you've discussed this very clearly, really honestly with people, but from a perspective of reality, you're talking, Brent, about checking every step, and that's really great, but that's because of what we're, I think, agreeing on here. So if the world has decided for all the wrong reasons coming from Sam Altman, not my best friend, that there's a mistake-ridden technology here we cannot free ourselves of. It's like Thomas More, who can free me of this man, You're never going to be free of this man. And so if that's true, are you resigned to that, and can we move beyond that? And I really appreciate you use the word transparency, and you use the word explainability. Now, my really good friend, Elon, who was a good friend of mine, has a bad habit, a couple bad habits. We all do. He named his company XAI. He doesn't have XAI. He has no product developed except that, Me Too thing. So it is the right answer, I think. But working hard toward getting into the world of transparency and explainability seems to me the only path out of this. If we really want to be careful, as Microsoft now says, about being responsible with not medical records necessarily, because language parts, it's great. It's made for language. I think you're totally spot on. But when you get into life-threatening situations, no. No, you would never do a diagnostic. You would never do a medical plan, which is what Peter Lee said last week. So does that view of the world fit what you're seeing?
Can I jump in really quickly?
Please.
Just in response to that. And I meant to say this earlier as well, but I'm glad you brought this up because one of the other things that we're seeing regulators do very consistently is making sure that there's a human in the loop, right? So when we're talking about diagnostics, for example, and it's a great example, I think it's probably the most important example here, is making sure that, and you see this not just in healthcare, you see this in employment, you see this in loans and insurance, always making sure that whatever the algorithm is doing, there is a human ultimately making a decision.
GDPR, right?
GDPR has that as well.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to add is, in the human in the loop model, I think for diagnostics purposes, it would be helpful to think of and use AI as an assistant to the process, not as the original or final decision maker, but actually as a tool that our clinicians and physicians can actually take a look and that's why operational efficiency workflows are probably the easiest things for us to implement. Just make our clinical staff actually happier with what they're doing, less paperwork. I've worked with so many physicians that have spent grueling amount of hours. They have to document their notes, but by implementing just a few quick summarization, helping them actually read the background of the patient before they go see them, I think it really helps. So while we probably don't want to just walk into a booth and talk to an AI and cure our cancer, I think we can really help our physicians be faster and more productive if we just use AI as a point of assistance, if you will.
That's what Satya Nadella said last week. Yeah.
And then the issue of what problem are you trying to solve? How much better can you get than the current approach with all of its flaws and warts? And how do you ensure that it doesn't go off the rails? We know that when people start to rely on automated systems, they can really lose some of their own critical thinking and skills. There are a couple of famous cases where pilots have gotten so used to autopilot flying the plane, there's an emergency, they overreact, the plane crashes, they've lost some of those skills because they're not trained on them anymore. So we have to keep humans in the loop and ensure that our own cognitive functions don't atrophy because we take it for granted that these algorithms are going to do our thinking for us.
So can I add a little?
Please.
So we also are in generative for some time. So my first paper on generative adversarial networks for small molecule drug design was published 2016, right? And then, so now we publish at the rate of about one paper every 10 days in either experimental science or AI, theoretical AI. But the most important paper that I think we've published was this TNIK paper in Nature Biotechnology, because it has a lot of experimental evidence that many different generative models work. And the way to avoid hallucination and get rid of many challenges that LLM present is benchmarking and reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning from human or experimental feedback or from algorithmic feedback, that's another interesting approach, really can evolve some of the systems to be so precise that you achieve atomic precision. And again, just read our Nature Biotech paper for that purpose. If you wanted to see how many generative systems can work in unison and produce really amazing experimental results, read our paper on Chemistry 42. So there we use 42 generative models. They are already pre-trained, so some are transformer-based, some are GAN-based, variational autoencoders, and they start generating molecules with the desired properties immediately. So they can actually, each one of them can generate a valid molecule, but you cannot trust it. So you have a huge reinforcement learning system that evaluates the output of every model. So big predictive, massive predictive system, more than 500 models to test whether the molecule has a certain feature or not. And usually you start with the cheapest models when you're trying to evaluate those molecules, because otherwise it becomes very expensive. And then you run it for like 72 hours. So billions of iterations, billions of molecules reviewed. Every time the generative model produces something that lacks the feature or is hallucinating, it gets punished. If it gets it right, it gets rewarded, and usually you can milk those molecules. You milk those models, like think about like 1,000 cows, right? And you really can milk them for very, very few valid molecules, and then they stop, right? So they start hallucinating again, and there's just not that many valid molecules it can assemble. So if your speed is not priority, so if you don't want a snappy response like with ChatGPT or even like IND submission writing, you probably don't have a lot of time to wait, right? Even though we probably can. So if you are doing chemistry, you can actually achieve atomic level precision. And there are ways around hallucination. You can really go and get very precise results. But we found the best application of LLMs for kind of end-to-end drug discovery is they can reason. So now they can run domain-specific models in specific sequences and run them just enough when you get enough molecules, when you get enough kind of end-to-end hypotheses, when you analyze laboratory robotics data. They can reason, and you don't need a human in the loop for massive amounts of experiments. And then you present it to the human, to really expert medicinal chemist or clinical pharmacologist or your CMO for that matter. They evaluate and they choose which path to take. But I can say that generative has achieved amazing precision when you give it time, and you also have a lot of experience. So what we see now in really advanced companies that work on generative AI, they cannot release some of those models yet, but it's unbelievable what they can achieve if you give it enough time. Can do physics simulations in generative with ultra-high precision.
Brandon, did you want to comment there on the explainability problem?
I'll just say briefly that I think we're all in violent agreement that it's hallucinations are not going to go away. Humans are also not perfect. And the answer is composite, a system of people, algorithms, organizations working at whatever each one of them can best contribute to the situation. And so I think these are tools. It's not an or conversation of replacing people with something else. It's how do we put these together and make it all work better.
And then the history is the humans get smarter when our tools get smarter.
Right.
But other than the atrophy problem.
Yes, other than the atrophy problem. Please, next question.
Hi, Teresa Dyke, One Health. Depending on the treatment area, many data sets can be missing data on all patient populations and potentially be using a therapeutic, particularly since they weren't included as part of the prior research. As these models get trained, how do you think regulations and development within the companies developing these AI tools will help to adapt to help address these gaps in discovery and becoming more inclusive?
It's a really great question, right? Our data sets are biased. We know that they're biased. The FDA has spoken a lot about this. How do we start to tackle that problem? Or begin to unravel it?
Well, you need to do practical projects to see if it works experimentally, right? And that's the only way. And of course, the FDA is the ultimate decision maker. If it works in a clinical trial, it works. And I think in some disease areas, there is enough data, there is abundance of data. In many cancers, you've got amazing data, and that's probably the lowest hanging fruit you should start with, and then expand to other areas where the data is more limited.
Maybe synthetic data, that's really very expensive and rather difficult to do, but I think to augment the data sets, it would be a good way to consider. It's not going to always work, but generating enough synthetic data sets, knowing where you're lacking and trying to sort of balance the model that way, I think that would be an interesting way to look.
So for populations that aren't in your RCT data, try and use real-world data to create synthetic control arms and see if the results are the same or how they align with what you've got from RCTs.
Let me just say, from a regulatory perspective, I think it's interesting to be thinking about this from an innovative perspective, like how do you use the data to solve the problem with the data? But what I see regulators doing is all the things that I've already described, which is how do you correct for it. But I think the risk assessment approach is actually really important here, because when we're talking about risk assessments, what regulators are often talking about, and it's a different flavor with different laws, right? So like the new privacy laws in the US, they all have some kind of risk or impact assessment. But the EU AI Act has a very robust one for high risk AI systems. And there it's risk about the data sets, and it's risk about the outputs, and it's risk about the outcomes, and about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Or you make a decision with an already vulnerable population.
And then you audit, right? And then it's not a static moment where you're simply making an assessment and you're providing and documenting it. You also have to consistently reevaluate it. So, if you find that maybe you missed the gaps in the data and they are producing later outcomes that are inconsistent with what you had intended or are creating bias, you do need to go back. You have to find an innovative solution, right? You can't. The regulation isn't going to stop that or create the solution for you, but it is going to create mechanisms to require you to find the problem.
So we've got to wrestle with the dark data, the missing data problem, the fact that, if there are patients with different kinds of insurance who don't present at the places where we're collecting the data, we run into problems. We can't even make synthetic controls because those patients just aren't in the data. So we have to become, even more human-oriented and inject ethics into what we're trying to achieve.
Inject governance.
Absolutely.
And one of the things might be interesting to consider regional models. So I think there was some work that done a while back that, certain hospitals had been developing certain models, and then they put it out in a different hospital system, and it failed because of the fact that regionally people are, there's diverse groups of people. In some certain areas, you might have certain diseases that are more prevalent, or certain conditions, access to food or lack of access to food. So I think looking at it regionally, it's very expensive, and I wouldn't recommend that we are there yet. For anyone to super undertake this. But I think as we move forward, looking at your population and then designing solutions for that population would be helpful.
Please.
Hi, my name is Alex Tinker. I'm here from the AAIH. I have a question that touches on this issue of auditing, mainly from a privacy and confidentiality perspective. So you have an algorithm, you have an LLM that spits out this beautiful IND application. Once that goes to the FDA gives feedback. How is your model learning from that feedback? How is your model learning from mistakes that are found in a medical record or mistakes a doctor finds? And how do you keep that stakeholder engaged when they're dealing with correcting an issue, right? So you have this tool that's being used as an assistant to submit these applications. At the same time, your system is reliant on their willingness to come bring that feedback back to you. At that point, you're dealing with more patient confidentiality issues, privacy issues, product confidentiality. How do you sort of keep that going, that improvement going once you've gotten to those closer to those endpoints?
Brandon, I think that's a question for you.
Yeah, sure. So in general, when it comes to any type of machine learning or AI, there's always an option to turn off learning. Use it in a purely output kind of fashion. It doesn't have to learn. There's always an option where you don't have to be learning from whatever you're running through the system. So that's just a general point. When it comes to the LMs, again, I think the flexibility and the need for very little input data, training data, what have you, is a huge boon here, because you can get feedback that is specific to your situation, your application, and you can incorporate that automatically into a revision without the need to retrain a model or do something elaborate like that, and then thus require like hundreds or thousands or millions of data points. So I guess my prediction is that it's not going to be much of an issue, because that you need so little data to get an improvement or an iteration on your output with these models that you're not going to run into any issues with needing loads of data, and then that is getting into other people's data or having to share your data with other people. So I think it's potentially becomes a moot point in this narrow application.
You touched on medical record. I just wanted to mention, I think monitoring is extremely important. So I think your data governance and having a group that looks after these things over time, so you don't just build it and forget it. You have to consistently monitor, and we know that models drift, and we know how to resolve that. So I think monitoring and having a process that you continuously improve is very important.
5,000-mile checkups for your day.
I'll just add to that. So on the preclinical level, and within my company, and maybe we're not the only one who is doing that, so we have a policy that we are not allowed as a company to use any proprietary data from patients. Even when I'm using my own data, I have a giant lab to process cells and organoids. If I want to do a biopsy here, right, I have to go through a board approval to be able to use even my own data. So we want to protect ourselves from the proprietary data from the world, and then offload the liability of doing clinical trial data analysis to companies, to CROs, who actually should have those guardrails in place when they work with proprietary patient data. So I don't do my own clinical trials, and I don't touch those data sets as well. I think that's a very important question. Yeah.
We're getting the hook here from the room, but let me just finish with one quick question I wanted to ask before we got out of the room. So this is the lightning round. The FDA, other regulators do horizon scanning. They look at technologies that are coming onto the horizon and say, what kind of regulatory frameworks do we need for something that's going to get to us in 3 years or 4 years or 5 years? Just really briefly, if you were advising regulators to focus their horizon scanning on a particular type of technology and where they need to think about developing innovative regulatory frameworks, where would you ask them to look or suggest they look right now? Just really quickly down the line here. Chris?
I'll start at the end.
Sorry, I got you. Brandon?
Obviously, I think generative models writ large is where the technology is going. I think the thing that is challenging there is evaluation, and important, as we've touched on in pretty much every question here. So I think providing frameworks for that, whatever they may be, data sets for evaluation, metrics, can go a long way.
Great. Alex?
They can look at our phase 2 study and phase 1's currently running,
Yeah.
and a few others. So I think there are very, very few companies out there that do have real AI-generated therapeutics going forward. I think they shouldn't give us any favors. They just should look at them closely.
Yeah, I would say enabling more open source work. I think that would be probably the next generation of things. You know, a lot of people right now are trying to make their own sort of private models, but I think we're going toward democratizing more open source data. So whatever allows people to be able to do that faster and better, I think would be great.
There are a lot of AI companies working on general AI, and I think that will strengthen.
All right. Terrific. Thank you very much. Please thank my panel.